The morning sun rose gently over the quiet streets of Savannah, Georgia. Spanish moss swayed in the breeze, hanging low from the ancient oak trees. It was a day meant to honor the passing of Earl Johnson, a respected war veteran whose name was well known in the community. Families and neighbors gathered, dressed in dark attire, their footsteps echoing against the cobbled pavements as they made their way towards Anderson Funeral Home. Inside the chapel, the air was heavy with silence. The polished oak coffin rested at the front, draped with an American flag and adorned with a single white lily. Earl's widow, Martha Johnson, sat in the front pew, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a folded handkerchief. Her son David stood nearby, his shoulders squared, but his eyes revealing the grief he carried. The atmosphere was solemn, yet beneath the stillness there lingered a quiet tension. The staff from Anderson Funeral Home moved briskly, whispering instructions to one another, their movements almost too hurried for such a delicate occasion. A subtle unease passed between some of the mourners, though none dared to voice it. As the organ began its low hymn, the chapel filled with voices. Friends recalled Earl's bravery during his service, his loyalty to his family, and his kindness towards neighbors. Stories flowed, both heartfelt and tender, bringing tears to the eyes of many. Yet, as the ceremony continued, David could not shake a faint sense of disquiet. He noticed the coffin seemed slightly different from what had been prepared days before, but grief clouded his certainty. The pallbearers exchanged glances as they took their places, preparing for the procession that would lead them to the gravesite. One of them, an older man named Charles, frowned faintly at the engraved plate fixed on the coffin's side. He leaned closer for a moment, but the organ swelled louder, drowning his attempt to speak. With a hesitant shake of his head, he stepped back into position. Martha's eyes remained fixed on the coffin, her heart heavy yet anchored by love. For her, this farewell marked the end of a lifetime of devotion. She whispered a quiet prayer, unaware that beneath the solemn ritual, a storm of confusion was already beginning to form. The pallbearers lifted the coffin with steady hands, stepping carefully down the chapel's narrow aisle. The sound of polished shoes against the wooden floor mixed with the low sobs of mourners. Outside, the air was heavy with the scent of magnolias, the summer heat pressing down as the crowd followed the slow march towards the waiting hearse. David walked behind his mother, his arm firm around her shoulders. He felt the weight of duty, as if his father's honor rested on his ability to remain strong. Yet his eyes returned again and again to the coffin. Something about the engraving, something about the proportions, gnawed him in silence. The hearse doors opened with a metallic creak. The coffin slid inside with a hollow thud, and for the briefest moment, the driver looked uneasy. His hand paused on the latch before forcing it shut. No one noticed, except Charles, who lingered behind the group. The cars lined up, headlights glowing against the haze of the morning. The funeral procession rolled slowly through the streets of Savannah, past weathered houses and silent onlookers who removed their hats in respect. Inside the family car, Martha pressed her lips together, her eyes never leaving the hearse. She whispered Earl's name again, her voice breaking like a fragile glass. And as the convoy drew closer to the cemetery gates, Charles leaned forward from his seat in the third car. His eyes narrowed at the plate upon the coffin. A single word, barely visible through the rear window, carved deep into the brass. It was not Johnson. The cemetery lay on the edge of the city, shaded by tall pines and marble angels. The mourners gathered in quiet formation as the coffin was carried towards the open grave. Birds scattered from the trees, startled by the groaning sound of the lowering mechanism being prepared. David stood rigid at the edge of the grave, his hands trembling as he stared at the nameplate. The sunlight caught it just enough for him to read the inscription. His breath caught in his throat. It was not Earl Johnson. The letters spelled out another name entirely. For a moment, the world seemed to fall silent. He blinked, his chest rising and falling with sharp, uneven breaths. Perhaps it was a mistake, a flaw in the engraving, a simple error by the funeral home. Yet as he leaned closer, his worst fear solidified. It was the name of a stranger. Charles stepped forward, his voice hoarse. "This is an earl." Gasps rippled through the mourners. Martha's face turned ashen, her knees buckling as she clutched at David's arm. A murmur swept through the crowd, whispers rising into confusion, then into anger. The staff from Anderson Funeral Home exchanged frantic glances, their faces drained of color. The priest stuttered, his prepared words faltering into silence. The coffin rested above the grave, its secret now laid bare for all to see. And in that moment, sorrow twisted into chaos. Voices rose in disbelief. Mourners stepped closer, demanding answers from the staff. Martha's sobs grew louder, her voice breaking into cries of outrage. David gripped the coffin, his knuckles pale, his fury shaking through him. "How could this happen?" he growled through clenched teeth. The funeral director, Mr. Anderson himself, stammered an explanation. His words stumbled over each other, offering apologies, assurances, excuses. Yet none could soothe the storm that now tore through the cemetery. The name on the coffin belonged to Thomas Walker, a man from Augusta, recently deceased under different circumstances. The revelation struck the mourners like a cruel joke. They had come to honor a hero, but now they stood before a stranger. Some guests shouted for the service to stop at once. Others demanded the return of Earl's body. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, as grief clashed with rage. A woman fainted near the rear of the crowd, her fall muffled by the grass. Martha collapsed into David's arms, her face buried in his chest. She did not cry Earl's name now. Instead, her voice broke into a single, hollow whisper. "Where is he?" The crowd encircled Mr. Anderson, their eyes sharp, their voices unyielding. He raised his hands as if to shield himself from the force of their anger. Sweat beaded across his brow, his polished composure stripped away. Charles stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This family deserves the truth. And they deserve it now." Mr. Anderson swallowed hard. His words were measured but hollow. He admitted there had been a mistake during preparation. Bodies had been transported, names crossed, tags misplaced. He insisted it was a clerical error, nothing more. But the crowd was not satisfied. To lose a loved one is pain enough, but to lose their very identity, to have them misplaced like luggage, was unbearable. Mourners shouted louder, demanding accountability. David clenched his fists, his voice rising above them all. "Bring my father back. Now." The staff shifted uneasily, their silence damning. Mr. Anderson nodded quickly, promising the body would be located, but the damage was done. Trust had been shattered, respect reduced to rubble. The ceremony, meant to be Earl's honor, was now a spectacle of humiliation. The coffin remained suspended above the grave, its brass plate glinting in the sunlight. It was not Earl. It never had been. The cemetery emptied in disarray, mourners scattering in disbelief. Some left in anger, others in tears, unable to bear the weight of what had occurred. Only the Johnson family remained, along with Charles, who refused to leave their side. Mr. Anderson returned to his office, issuing hurried calls to his staff. Records were checked, documents shuffled, drivers questioned. Yet confusion thickened rather than cleared. Earl's body was not in Savannah. It had been sent elsewhere. David stood in the funeral home's reception, his hands pressed flat against the counter. His voice was sharp, his patience thinning with every passing minute. Martha sat nearby, pale and silent, her eyes hollow from exhaustion. Hours dragged by as the truth slowly unfolded. Earl had been mistakenly transported to Augusta, switched with Thomas Walker. His body now rested in the care of another grieving family who had been equally deceived. The revelation landed like a second blow, as cruel as the first. David's jaw tightened, fury simmering beneath his grief. A meeting was arranged with the Walker family, but the thought of confronting strangers over his father's misplaced body left him with a bitter taste of dread. The night fell heavy over Savannah, the Johnsons returning home not with closure, but with questions that gnawed at their very souls. The following morning, David and Charles set out for Augusta, the road stretching long and lonely beneath the rising sun. Martha remained behind, too frail to endure the journey. Her tear-streaked face haunted David's thoughts as he gripped the steering wheel. The landscape passed in silence. Pine forests, abandoned barns, and winding rivers blurred together, each mile carrying them closer to the truth. Charles spoke little, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his silence heavy with unspoken anger. They arrived at the Walker family home, a modest house with peeling paint and a garden of withered roses. The air felt charged with unease. The Walkers awaited them, faces grim, suspicion flickering in their eyes. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Mr. Walker's widow, Eleanor, sat stiffly in her chair, her voice sharp with indignation. She too had discovered the mistake. The coffin delivered to Augusta bore the name Earl Johnson. The two families stared at one another across the narrow living room, their grief colliding like waves against rock. They were strangers bound by sorrow, anger, and betrayal. Words grew heated, accusations thrown, until Charles raised his voice above the rest. "We are not enemies. We are victims of the same deceit." The room fell into silence, the weight of his words pressing heavily upon them. And in that silence, they agreed to uncover the truth together. The Johnsons and Walkers, united by tragedy, returned to Anderson Funeral Home demanding full disclosure. Mr. Anderson, pale and shaking, reluctantly opened his records. Inside lay evidence of negligence far deeper than anyone expected. Papers were missing. Tags had been swapped. Bodies had been mishandled. Invoices bore errors, signatures forged in haste. It was not merely a single mistake. It was a chain of careless acts hidden beneath layers of polished wood and velvet curtains. David's voice thundered through the room. "You treated our fathers as if they were nothing more than numbers on a page." Mr. Anderson trembled, his excuses faltering. He admitted financial strain, overworked staff, a system stretched beyond its limits. But no excuse could erase the damage. The truth was undeniable. The two families demanded the immediate return of their loved ones. Mr. Anderson promised it would be done, though his eyes betrayed his fear. Fear not only of losing his reputation, but of something darker that lingered behind his words. For there was still one unanswered question. If Earl had been sent to Augusta, then where exactly had Thomas Walker been sent first? Late into the evening, Charles searched the dim corridors of the funeral home. His lantern cast shadows across rows of silent coffins, each draped in dust and secrecy. The smell of chemical preservative clung to the air, heavy and suffocating. In a locked chamber at the far end, he found a coffin unmarked, its lid loosely fastened. His hands trembled as he pried it open. The face inside was not Earl, nor Thomas. It was a stranger, unidentified, left abandoned like forgotten property. Charles's breath caught in his chest. He called for David, who arrived moments later, his eyes wide with horror. They realized the mistake went beyond their families. There were others. Other names, other bodies, lost and misplaced within the system. The funeral home had concealed more than incompetence. It had hidden shame. David's fists clenched at his sides, his voice low and shaking. "This was never just about us. This is bigger, much bigger." The walls of the funeral home seemed to close in, the silence pressing like a suffocating weight. What began as a single funeral gone wrong had now unraveled into a secret far darker than either family had imagined. Word spread quickly through Savannah and Augusta. Families who had entrusted their loved ones to Anderson Funeral Home returned in anger, their suspicions ignited by the revelations. The once respected establishment now stood surrounded by voices demanding justice. Mourners filled the streets outside, holding photographs of the departed, their cries echoing into the night. Police arrived, their presence necessary to contain the swelling fury of the crowd. Inside, David stood face to face with Mr. Anderson. The director's hands shook, his voice reduced to a desperate whisper. He begged for forgiveness, claiming he had only sought to keep the business alive. But David's eyes burned with fury. His voice rose above the clamor outside, sharp as steel. "You robbed us of dignity. You robbed us of peace." Martha entered quietly, her steps fragile yet determined. She placed her hand upon the coffin, finally returned to them, Earl's name gleaming in the candlelight. Her tears fell, but her voice was steady. "We will take him home." The crowd's shouts grew louder, the air thick with the scent of smoke and fury. The funeral home, once a place of solemn trust, now stood on the edge of ruin. And within its walls, the Johnsons prepared to reclaim their final farewell, amidst a storm that threatened to consume them all.